Lovely to see you all this morning, and thank you for coming in the light snow today. Today I'm going to introduce you to a painting by Lorenzo Lotto, who was born in Venice in 1480 and died at the age of 76. And this small painting you can, on a better day, travel to New Haven to see in the Yale University Art Gallery. It's part of a private collection, but currently with us. And it's one of my current favorites. Sometimes the favorites shift a little from month to month, but I particularly love this. It's a very small panel painting, as you'll see from the dimensions. You know, a smallish size painting that you can, it's hung so that you can step in very close and look at it in quite some detail. And that is a feature of it that I want to accentuate today as I talk about what is represented, as well as aspects of the function. And you'll see that the function connects to the iconography, which connects to our theme about the Eucharist. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the panel itself, which enlarged here gives us an opportunity to be able to focus on some of the smaller details that are very important for thinking about how this image functions and how people would have interacted with it. And of course today we interact with it in a very different context on the museum wall, and it's excised, if you like, from the Eucharistic setting of which it played such an important part. So that doesn't mean to say that it's stripped of some of the significance that it originally had, but we might want to work a little harder as we look at it to think about how it resonated with the patrons for whom Lotto was working and for people viewing this originally in the 16th century, but also thinking about how we might take that image forward into thinking ourselves about the image of the dead Christ, as you see here, and how we might connect it with some of the themes relating to the Eucharist that you've been speaking about during this series. This subject that I'll talk about shortly, but representing the dead Christ, different ways of presenting the body before the viewer and enabling certain emotions or responses within the viewer. So this presentation that we see here of Christ derives in some important ways from the methods that were used for portrait painting in terms of, even from the ancient world, Roman portraits of just showing the bust or the upper half of an individual and presenting that bust in strict frontality to the viewer. And we see in the development of icons, particularly in the Byzantine tradition, of the ways in which that type of a portrait was utilized specifically for religious figures to enable a kind of interaction with individuals that would promote prayer or reflection or devotion on the individual represented and their life and their characteristics and qualities that we might want to emulate. But in Western art by this period, so from in the 15th and into the early 16th century, we see something different happen with devotional images that are stepping away from that icon tradition of frontality and presenting the subject directly before us and doing something a little different. So, so the dead body of Christ here is shown sitting on the edge of the tomb, which you'll notice the angle of the tomb inviting us almost into the image in a particular way that doesn't happen necessarily with icons, in order that we are drawn straight into to think about the body of Christ here, which is, as I said, this point after the deposition and prior to the burial, Christ dead with clear indications of the means of death, so nails in or nail points in the hands. Not that you can see the hand, his right hand, very well, but also the wound in the side, indicating the piercing. So these elements, pictorial elements, which are key to us reading the nature of the image, connect to the narrative, but something else is happening beyond the narrative, as I said. Two main indications of that are this gold background that's used, which is very much in the tradition of icon painting, in some respects to, again, work to extract this figure from a narrative context and suspend it without a landscape or without any other built environment behind us, to allow us to reflect more on the physical body of Christ. And here he is upheld or supported by two angels, who their faces, one on the left looking down out of the image and the other one looking into the face of Christ. And these figures function in an important way for us as viewers to think about our own emotional responses as we contemplate theirs and their function in supporting the body, and not just supporting the body on the edge of the tomb, but presenting the body to us to think about the nature of Christ's death and some of its broader significance. And this is a classic representation, if you like, of a subject that we refer to as the Man of Sorrows, or you will see it referred to as the Imago Pietatis, which is literally an image of pity, an image that numerous artists across a long period of history, really from the 12th century, at least in the West, onwards, play with in different ways. And some versions, you can visit the Morgan Library at the moment to see a version of this by Giovanni Bellini, which has been in an Italian collection, which has been conserved and is on display at the moment. And you can also see and Bellini's has an expanded scene where Mary and John are present either side of Christ in the positions that we have the angels with some other figures. You can also see with that painting a panel by Perugino where it's just the figure of Christ as the Man of Sorrows. Often the Man of Sorrows, the arms are shown crossed before the body, a very traditional iconography that has a specific history that I won't go into now, but this is all of it to say that there are a number of different ways that artists explored this theme. Who was with Christ? Is he propped up on one side of the tomb? Mary and John in the tomb with him? But all different ways of reflecting on and thinking very closely about what the implications were physically for Christ in the crucifixion and in his death, and the ways in which we can enter in to think about images of pity, to have compassion, to connect with those figures in the scene emotionally, such that we have a more visceral response in thinking about the death and its process. And with regard to function, when you see many Renaissance Italian paintings in collections today, and if you come to the Yale University Art Gallery, which has one of the largest collections of Italian paintings of the late medieval, early Renaissance period outside of Italy, so you'll see a very large breadth in terms of understanding not just the history of painting at that period in Italy, but the history of the ways in which the image within Christianity was fundamentally transformed through the commissioning of altarpieces and other objects that were a central part of the liturgy. Many of the paintings that we see from this period are small panels, including this one, very small, that have been cut out of their original context. So in some cases, large altarpieces that someone decided really wasn't cutting the mustard in terms of fashion at a particular time, and they were cut. The panels were, the altarpiece was dismantled, and the individual components dispersed, and that's how many collectors built their collections of paintings from this period, by purchasing smaller components. So it's very intriguing with this particular panel. When I first saw it, I thought, well, perhaps it's an upper portion of an altarpiece. And indeed, we do find, particularly altarpieces in the Renaissance in Venice, that the Man of Sorrows forms the top panel component of a sort of triangular shaped altarpiece. And you'll also see a Spanish altarpiece in the Morgan collection that has a small Man of Sorrows at the top, alongside images of the instruments of the Passion and Mary and John. So I thought, oh, maybe that's what it is. And in fact, it had a very specific function, which an Italian scholar, Andrea Franchi, he did some detective work in archives and found a record book that Lotto kept of his commissions, documenting who requested a particular painting, and how much he would charge them, how much the wood would cost, how much the gilding would cost, what subject they wanted. And Franchi found reference to a panel that was gilded, that was requested by a community outside of Venice for a Man of Sorrows. And Franchi thinks it is this panel. And the purpose of the work was intended to be a pax, P-A-X, which some of you may not have encountered as an object before, but the pax was a small tablet that was used within the liturgy that was to be kissed at the sign of the peace in the service. So an altar server would present it to the priest, who would kiss it first, and then it would be wiped clean very dutifully, and then passed for others to kiss. So this was intended as a panel, he thinks, to be used in that specific Eucharistic context, and therefore, going back to the comments I made about its small size and the opportunities that smallness affords for close looking and interaction with the body of Christ, that would be the context in which it was used. Now, mostly we find that a pax is made out of a metal substance, or sometimes ivory, not always wood. You can think about what would happen after repeated kissing and moisture exchange. Wood's not necessarily going to stand up quite so well as metal. And also the format of these are often horizontal rather than vertical, which prompts us to ask a few questions about this panel, but nonetheless, I'm going to show you some comparisons for us to think about this function and therefore the implications of the imagery. And I'm going to show you two different examples. The first one here is within a painting by Lotto himself, which is a nice connection with our own panel of the representation of a moment within the liturgy, obviously connected to St. Bridget, but I'm focusing us, for the sake of time, push us through to focus on the altar here, where we're going to look specifically here on the altar. You'll notice this object, which is a pax. And you'll notice its position. Actually, if we go back to the previous slide, you will notice this large representation of the crucifixion that within this painting Lotto has placed behind the altar, but the pax itself on the altar during the celebration of the Eucharist is where we would expect, therefore, our panel to be used. Another example is in this painting of a different context of celebration of the Eucharist by Raphael, where on the altar here you'll see the back of a pax. It's always nice to join our different pieces of source information of people talking about the use of the pax, the commissioning of an object, seeing it painted within a particular Eucharistic context, but also occasionally being able to see a little different dimension of it, seeing the back of it, which we wouldn't ordinarily see. And you'll notice it's a little bit like a bookend, if you like, with a stand jutting out from the backs. Now, the Lotto pax that is currently at Yale is, as we saw, a slightly different shape, not directly comparable to a more vertical orientation of the pax here. But one of the things that we think is that, given the condition of the base of this panel and the back, that at some point it was cut down, and you'll notice, I think earlier in the presentation I showed you, at some point in the history of its collection, someone nicely framed it with red velvet around the edge. And so what we also find with the collection of fragments of Renaissance panels, whether from altarpieces or other objects, is that following their dismemberment or circulation, that collectors decide if they want to use it in another context or they want to frame it for their own use, that they'll cut it to suit their own purposes. The last time that I was here, and some of you were at that talk, I spoke about this painting, which is in the Metropolitan Museum collection, of the so-called legend of the Mass of Gregory. And I'm not going, again, perhaps for the sake of time, to test you if you remember anything about this legend. But when we're thinking about the Eucharist and why this representation of the Christ as the man of sorrows would be appropriate or have a particular synergy placed on the altar, the legend of the Mass of St. Gregory is particularly important. And so some of you may remember that, so the story goes, Gregory was celebrating Mass, and a woman, there are different versions of the legend, but a woman came to receive the bread, and the same woman had baked the bread for the purpose of the Eucharist. For that celebration. And she came to the altar, and she was disbelieving that the bread that she had made at home could be transformed into the body of Christ. And Gregory, in celebrating, has a vision of Christ before him. And I think in one version, the bread is transformed into a finger of Christ, or there are different versions of the story. But the point being that, of course, this goes into aspects of medieval theology that I don't want to unpack now, but the idea of transubstantiation, that in the process of the celebration of the Eucharist, that the bread and the wine do become transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And so the legend is supporting this notion. And images began to develop that expanded on the legend as it is recorded in some literary texts to develop quite elaborate imaginings of what Gregory actually experienced at the altar during the celebration of that Eucharist. And relatively standard iconographies develop, even though artistic imagination can go wild in terms of the attention to detail. And you'll remember here, in this particular case, Christ is shown as a full figure appearing before Gregory, and of course this is a quite literal feeding into the understanding of transubstantiation, so he's bleeding directly into the chalice. So it's this legend and the traditions that emerge both visually as well as in Christian literature about Gregory that directly informs the development of images such as we see here from Lotto, where the Man of Sorrows in many ways becomes almost like a visual counterpart of the Eucharist, and that the pax as an object, as we've seen in other examples here, placed on the altar, becomes an opportunity to further reflect on the body broken of Christ himself and its relation to the bread broken on the altar. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity.
It's hard to see with the reflection here, but there are 3 sets of rays that are coming out. So often we will have, as you will perhaps be familiar with, the halo or the nimbus that is incised or punched into the gilding for artwork of this period, that may have a cross form within the shape of the halo. And in this case, we do not have the arc of the halo, we just have the cross form, which has been rendered in 3, each ray, if you like, or arm of the cross has 3 lines that are delicately painted in white that are to evoke that. Another component, this is a good point that you've alighted on, another subtle but important component of the painting to indicate the divinity of Christ here, so that there's this direct jostling, if you like, between the almost hyper-realistic representation of the dead body, or attention to how to represent flesh as well as the points of the wounding to augment the sense of suffering that's being conveyed here, as well as components that can articulate the divine nature. Artists prior to Lotto, so particularly Giovanni Bellini or Mantegna, are struggling with, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but working with the pictorial traditions that are coming in from Constantinople via icons, and experimenting with ways that a devotional image, or the ways in which an image might function in a devotional context, and also be connected to narrative, but be more directly engaging into the viewer's space. Yes. So and Mantegna and Bellini are doing this in very important ways that hold in tension both traditions in Byzantine painting, which are highly revered, because that the understanding is that to replicate a particular pictorial type for representing, for instance, the Virgin and Christ, in the process of replication, the image continues to have power. So you want to replicate it accurately rather than be innovative and so forth, because the image, its iconography and its ongoing life through replication is part of its continued power. So that is on the one hand. So many of these objects are coming in, as you say, to Venice, and people are excited about that, and see the importance and the role of those images and their antiquity, which is also part of their continuing hold on the imagination. And then on the other hand, artistic developments in Italy in particular. So Alberti, for instance, who's writing in the 15th century, talking about the ways in which an artist could effectively narrate in the image a religious a story. Yeah. And Alberti talks about the the ways in which limbs and movements should be naturalistic in order that the viewer is drawn into feel something of what the characters in the story are feeling, that there is a communication not just of the elements of the story, but an integral part of that being what the people are feeling that are participating in that story. So that development is happening in Italy, and so in terms of religion and Christian images in the middle here, how do those two traditions speak to each other? Because they have they look very different, but they're still doing similar kind of work for Christians. So in terms of the role of images in private devotion, as well as the devotion as a collected community, there's a lot of experimentation and engagement with the two models, and so Lotto, in some respects, in this work, and this may be speaking to what the patron wants, is still hanging on to an earlier period of experimentation with this dialogue. So the gold background, which the Bellinis, the family, Jacopo and his two sons, have already been experimenting with and stepping away from, in terms of situating the tomb and Christ into a landscape. And for example, in some cases, we might see a landscape receding in the background, but in the background, if we look really closely, we might see a tiny representation of the crucifixion on a hill in the background, or people leaving Golgotha, so that you understand a broader narrative context. They've already been experimenting with that, but in this case, Lotto's just using the icon sort of flat background tradition. So, and that might also have something to do with the function of the packs. It's probably in that moment of connection and seeing the image, you probably don't want to be thinking about, oh, there's a crucifixion in the background. Like, it's maybe a simpler, clearer picture. So there's a lot of quite bold experimentation at this period, which means that Christian art is undergoing a radical transformation that we take for granted in many respects. When you go to the Morgan and see Bellini's, it's exquisite, and you probably feel all sorts of emotions yourself in looking at it, as well as wonderment at how exquisitely painted it is. Yes, because they also appear, I mean, the image appears in a variety of different contexts. So, including on doors for tabernacles, or there are some very beautiful miniature examples in manuscripts. So the intimacy is nuanced, I guess, if you like, depending on the context, but certainly the invitation into this image, which is something also that's very different from what is, if you're familiar with icons, that on the whole it's very clear that we're here and the figures are there, and those figures have a connection with the divine realm and are facilitating our access to that, but it's not the same kind of intimate connection of drawing in, or even with the angels, which their own movements there with the body, as you rightly say. I mean, the body isn't broken and collapsed. There's, in this subtle twisting and the variation of the hands, there's almost a pulse through the figure, that this dialogue between the movements of the heads is also a mechanism to bring us in, both to contemplate their own facial expressions, but also particularly with this angel, this is a point of access for us into this, and that's part of the danger too of it, because it no longer, with an icon, or an image that is maintaining a stricter adherence to form, there's control about how a viewer can interact with it and how it's used. There's an erosion of that once we begin to play in this way, and it becomes open, to the erotic dimension, if you like, but it becomes open in ways that then images become more dangerous.
All right. Thank you so much, Felicity.
Oh, thank you.
And I think
By the joy. Thank you.